Here's what we're going to do today. We're going to knit a long strip of hats and then finish them. So we will start by E-wrapping the required needles and then knitting the length of the hat. This is the simplest possible version. Our knitting's going this way. So when you just do that and don't put any other finish, no ribbing, no hem, what will happen is the outside edge will make a rolled brim, which is really quite a good look. And you only have to account for those rows that are taken up in the brim in the length, and no other adjustment is needed. Of course, these can be knitted in any size, but I'll give you some numbers in a minute. Today we're going to knit a 19-inch hat. When we have completed the number of rows for the hat, we will knit one row of ravel cord, then a few rows of waste yarn in a contrasting color, and another row of ravel cord, and then we will begin another hat. We do not even have to cast on, but I will E-wrap again because that means that I'll have a finished edge and not have to bind off after the work is off of the machine. We'll keep moving up whatever weights are needed so as to keep the downward pressure ideal, and just keep knitting. And if the hats hit the floor and they're between your feet, you just move your feet apart and keep going. What I'm showing you is my hats by the yard pattern. It is in the book, Stripping for Charity, and there are a lot more and more complicated hats there with fancier features, hems, lace, a number of things, tuck stitch. You can use all sorts of things. So that's what the book is full of. But this is the introductory basic hat, which is terrific for charity knitting and knitting a lot of hats for something like if you have a team who needs matching hats. Hats with character can be knitted in the same way. That's another of my hat books. So here's what we're going to do. Cast on 95, knit 56 rows, knit one row of ravel cord, 10 to 20 rows of waste yarn, another row of ravel cord, and repeat. And for your information, what I'm going to be using is yarn that gets 5 stitches, 8 rows per inch to get this hat. So let's get started. All right, let's start putting needles into work and casting on. You all know the E-wrap, I'm sure, but it's just making the letter E around every needle that you plan to have in work. So we'll all go across, casting on our 95, and I'll see you when I'm across. Now it's time to feed the yarn into the yarn feeder and check on your stitch size. You're looking at me working on a bulky machine that has 9mm spacing between the needles. They're on 9mm centers. This particular gauge, 5 stitches, 8 rows per inch, will also work on a mid-gauge machine, but you'll probably need to go up to around stitch size 7. A mid-gauge, by the way, has between 6.5 and 7 millimeters between the needles, and they vary quite a bit by brand, but virtually all of them will get this gauge. You'll just have to experiment with stitch size. Now you can see my needles already beginning to draw back because I am set to knit back from hold. Let's pull this away. This machine obviously has that setting. If yours doesn't, you just have to go to upper working position to knit this first row, and across we'll go. After the very first row, it's a little early to get weights on sometimes, and you can make the next row considerably simpler by pulling the needles back forward if you are able to knit back from hold and doing that. Then you rarely have issues with dropped stitches or jams. Now you should be able to hang weights without a problem. I've got a wide pin weight there. You know what you need for your machine. Many times just claw weights are adequate, and you may only need them on the ends. Now it's time to knit our 56 rows. And that's boring to watch, so I'm going to finish mine off camera. You finish yours and we'll get back together. My rows are complete. I actually did one extra because I wanted to get back over here where it's easier for me to aim the camera so you can see. Now it's time for our ravel cord, and I'm going to lay this where you can see it, I hope. What I'm using is a cone of very thin, slippery, strong yarn. It is not official ravel cord. Normally for this project, most of us won't have enough different little packets of ravel cord, and this works just fine. I'm going to try to read what the label says in here. This was a thrift store find. It's polyester. It doesn't give a weight. It does say F/D or 0, and it's Robeson Anton Textile Company. The point, though, is not its specific thing. Synthetics work very well if they're tightly spun, slippery, and strong. I can break this with my hands if I must, but it hurts. It's that strong. So that's a good thing here. And I'm going to thread it into the carriage. In order to thread it, I need to remove the main yarn. And we will be using this main yarn as a gathering thread and a seaming yarn. So I'm going to leave a good length, at least 24 inches. Drop it out of the carriage, and now thread my ravel cord. All threaded up, let's knit one row across. The waste yarn I have to work with is really for a standard gauge machine, but it's not going to matter. It's just a space holder, basically. So I'm not going to change stitch size. I'm just going to knit across and knit several rows. Here we are, all the waste yarn's knitted. Snip it and remove it from the feeder. Let's have a look at what we've got. You can clearly see the rose color is the main hat. The turquoisey stuff, aqua maybe, is my ravel cord. And the loose dark blue is my waste yarn. Now time for another piece of ravel cord. And across we go. We are ready for the next hat, just like that. We'll finish them all at once later. But this is a good time to move your weights up. You probably already know the weights do the most good, especially at the edges when they're up near the top of the work. So to avoid getting any stitches with naughty ideas of jumping off, we will move them up. And here's a very cool feature of this pattern. I'm going to continue with my rose yarn, but if I only had odds and ends, or I was trying to use up odds and ends to good advantage, this need not be the same yarn. It need not even be the identical gauge. If I were knitting for charity, I would know that somewhere near a 19-inch circumference would fit somebody. It doesn't have to be exact. I'm e-wrapping left-handed, sorry for the clumsiness. So across I will go, e-wrapping my next hat, you too. I'm e-wrapped. Before we begin, a quick double check. The weights are in position, left and right, and my stitch size is still correct. You can't see it, but I can. So this time we do not need to worry about bringing needles forward after the first row because we've already got fabric holding weights down below. We just knit 56 rows. Here I go. Okay. Well, let's all continue, and I'll see you at the end of 56. My rows are completed. I'm going to make sure I've got a good yarn tail. Break the yarn, pull it out, and now it is time to add another ravel cord and waste yarn. But this time I'm going to vary just slightly. If by chance you really have nothing to use for ravel cord, that need not ruin your project as long as you have waste yarn. It can be done without the ravel cord, and I'm going to do that this time so that when we go to finishing the hats, I can show you how to manage without a ravel cord. Normally, when I do a strip of hats like this, I do a lot of them, between 10 and 20. But we're going to stop with 2 so that you can just see how it's done. You get the idea. Numbers 2 through 400 are the same, although you wouldn't really want a pile of 400 hats because then you'd have no place to sit. But 2 through 20 being realistic. Let's just drop this off. Usually when the work comes off of the machine, you need to give it a lengthwise pull to set the stitches. So I did that. And now I am looking for the yarn tail at the top of the first hat. There it is. So I want to thread that into a yarn needle. Now this is going to be used in 2 ways. We'll gather the hat crown with it. It's still attached, of course, which is very handy. And then we'll seam the hat edges. This is actually quite easy. The only tricky thing is you need to make sure not to miss any of these top live stitches. And just in and out, all the way across the top of the hat. Inserting our yarn tail on its needle through each of the live stitches. You do want to be a little careful not to catch that strand of ravel cord because we want to be able to pull it out easily. I do not get at all fussy about which direction I approach these from, top or bottom. I tend to stitch up, down like a running stitch, but if something wiggles around and it's easier to catch it the other way, it doesn't matter. What does matter is that you do them in order, because otherwise you won't be able to pull the gathering thread in smoothly. So all the way across like this. So here's what we end up with. Here's my yarn tail on the needle coming out at the opposite end from where I started. Do not snug up the drawstring yet, because first we want to free this ravel cord and pull it out. And I'm starting to do that, and because it's so strong and slippery, it should just slide right out, neatly separating the 2 pieces of knitting, in this case the blue waste yarn and the pink of the hat. It's long, so it takes a minute, and you may have to go to the other end and loosen it up as I did, as I am doing right now. It seems to have tied around my yarn tail, but this is easily fixed. We don't care what happens to this ravel cord, it's disposable. It's from a big cone, so I can just snip it, and now it should pull freely out. And it is. Ta-da! Now they're 2 separate pieces. Alright, here's a perspective where you can see what's going on a little differently. Here's our cast on edge, which is rolling up just as promised. Here's our gathered edge, which I have begun to gather in, but not finished gathering in. Here are the 2 edges of the work, which will become a center back seam. And here is my drawstring ready to proceed with. So here we go, pulling on the drawstring. Of course it gathers up right where you are, and you need to work the gathers around so that the entire top is drawn in. Like that. This little O, we want it to get as small as possible, and that is going to be all that keeps the hat together from now on. And so I like it to be strong. I not only draw it in tightly and stitch it to the other end, But did you see I allowed my yarn tail to double? So from henceforth I'll be working with doubled yarn. I'll tuck that into the inside and weave it in. And I'm going to tuck this to the inside, and now we're going to work from the inside for a minute. There's the O, my finger's in it. Now I like to stitch across it a couple of times. Don't want any breezes making free with our headgear. Okay. Now the doubling up is optional, I admit, but I like this area good and strong. So I'm going to tie to that yarn tail now. My O is complete. I've still got main yarn on a yarn tail here. I'm going to cut one end of it near my knot, because now it's time to use this same yarn for seaming, and I only need a single thickness for seaming. And I will say it's also okay to sew these seams on the sewing machine if you're comfortable doing that. As far as I know, it's not actually a moral issue, though we were raised to believe it might be. But this one I'm going to backstitch, which is down, up, near the edge of the seam, then back up a little, down, up, moving forward, down, backing up, moving forward, and so on, all the way down the edge, except for the very bottom. See you when I get there. One more note as I seam. What we're aiming for is to stitch right next to the edge columns of stitches for the neatest seam. This is a good place to practice doing this neatly, because the sky doesn't fall if it's imperfect. Most people who are not knitters will never notice. We'll notice, but we'll just get better at it as we go along. Now I nearly am to the bottom, and when we get close, we need to stop and assess how much of the seam actually rolls out and up, because we want to reverse the seam at the point that that happens so as not to see the seam. Again, if you just kept going, you would see a little bit of seam and the sky wouldn't fall. But this much is rolling up. It tends not to at the very edge until it's seamed, because it's rolling the other direction there. But we can figure out that the bottom roll is going to start about here. That's typical, depending on the fabric, between 1 and 2 inches. So let me mark that with a safety pin. Between 1 and 2 inches from the cast on is what I should have finished saying. So I am close. I'm going to seam down to the safety pin the way I have been. Tighten that up. Down. Up. Down. Up. And here is the bottom of the seam going this direction. So I'm going to whip stitch around it and knot through my working yarn to secure it. Now I can release my safety pin, turn the edges around, and finish the seam on what would normally be the outside of the hat, but it's going to roll up and be hidden. And honestly, I like the skinniest seam I can here, and it is going to roll up and be hidden. So lots of times I whip stitch it, even though that's not a classic hat seam under normal circumstances, but I think you'll see in a minute why. Now here's our roll coming around. I can just take my working yarn and stitch it to secure it. We've got another yarn tail here I'll need to deal with in a second too. Any little stray strands, neaten them up with your stitching. There's my other yarn tail. I will pull it through to the other side and weave them both in a minute. Let me be sure this one is secured, the yarn I've been stitching with, and weave it in. Just stitching it in and out of the seam allowance works fine. Now I can thread the remaining yarn tail. This one is left over from the cast on into the same yarn needle, which is now free for action. Push it through. If I'm in any way concerned, I can secure this one by knotting it around the stitch also. I tend to go for sturdiness over perfection if I have to choose when I'm making hats for children or charity. If they're fancy hats, I might go the other way. But for ones that people aren't going to have a lot of resources to look after, I think that makes sense. This kind of hat does have a gathered top. You can see that the brim, even though we didn't even do a stitch size change, is quite good looking. I've set it on a propane canister in case you're wondering about my fancy hat form. But it's an entirely presentable hat that was very, very quick to make. A refinement for other times is to make the first few rows 2 inches worth is what I usually do. So in this case it would be the first 16 at a tighter stitch size. And that will make the brim, it won't ever pull in because it's multiple layers, but it'll make it snugger for a more windproof fit. And of course you can add pom-poms, decorations, and buttons at the top. And let me tell you a quick tip, if you would prefer a slouch hat, this is more a beanie fit, snug to the skull. All you have to do is add some length, 2 inches or more does the trick. Here's our second hat. And on all subsequent hats after the first one, you need to make sure you know which is the top, which is this. This is where I worked into waste yarn without a ravel cord, and which is the bottom, which is this. And there are several identifying features. One is that I know I used ravel cord, but the other is that you can see my E-wrapped cast on. So this is a closed edge, and I can now pull out my ravel cord, and the bottom of the hat will be nicely finished. There it comes. This should just pull away. We have a neat edge. This hat is just like the other, or it will finish to be just like the other. The only difference in getting to that finish is that I do not have a ravel cord here. So this process is just the same as on the other hat, except that I have to be careful not of the ravel cord because it doesn't exist, but not to snag the blue waste yarn. Because it's fuzzier yarn, it's slightly more work, but with a little care, it's not a problem. So I'll go across running the gathering thread through. So this is what we get. And just as before, we want to separate the two pieces, but we're going to need to snip in a few places because the blue yarn is not strong enough and smooth enough to just pull out in one piece. Occasionally you can just snip at each end and give it a tug, but that can be hard on the fabric depending on the yarn. So we just do it in segments, and that's the reason for showing you this. It's a little bit more work right now, but not so much more work that you need to worry if you can't find a ravel cord. Let's see how much of it I can pull before I feel like I need to snip it. And I really don't need to snip it, I can break it. Oh my goodness, I'm pulling out more than I expected. You'll see it come apart. And here's where it stopped. I can feel it. You can't see it yet. There we go. All right, repeat that operation. This is smoother and stronger than I realized. But I think you get the point. It's not a one-step smooth pull if you don't use ravel cord, but neither is it a big deal. Almost there. And there it is, free. Totally normal to have to pick off a few pieces of blue fuzz, but it's ready to be finished just as the other hat was. And my yarn tail on my yarn needle is still in position. So have fun knitting your hats by the yard, and when you want to expand the possibilities, have a look at Stripping for Charity and Hats with Character. You can even get faces on hats like this. Ears, just a few more minutes of work per hat will give you all sorts of possibilities, so have a look at those.